Well, welcome back. It's Mark Fielding Pritchard from ME Fieldings here again with some more of these training videos. You'll notice that there's a little bit of a change of pace now. Previously we've always looked at IPSAs or we've looked at IFRS. Now we're looking at interest rate swaps, and there's no accounting in this at all. Having said that, if you are a student of ACCA or you are a student of ICAEW, ICAS and so on, you do kind of need to know this stuff anyway. Once again, if you have turned this on by accident, I apologise for that. But please send a link to anybody who might be interested in this. And if you do like it, please make a comment. Please send us messages. We do get messages from a fair number of you. And I will also apologise for my voice. I have a terrible cold. Me and the rest of the family all struck down. Right, interest rate swaps. We're looking at, therefore, what these things are and how they work and what the risks of them are. And the reason that we're doing this is because a couple of our clients are now looking at these and looking to organise them. And the organisation is very simple. You can run the documentation off the internet, and the bank will organise everything for you. The bank that organises the swap. Right, interest rate swaps. Thank you for listening. Let's move on to slide number 2. So what actually is, therefore, an interest rate swap? Well, a swap is a situation where we have, and remembering that we're just doing this in a sort of classroom environment here. In a classroom environment, it works in the situation where you have two companies and both of them borrow money. They both want to borrow the same sums of money, and they both want to borrow those sums of money for the same period of time. What happens then is that they pay each other's interest, and as the slide says, they sort of pay each other's interest. In fact, they just pay the margins. So they pay each other's interest, and by doing this they save money. That all sounds very good, very kind of magical and mystical for people who've not been through this before. That was kind of the original situation back in the 1960s and the 1970s. A bank would step in and it would match two companies. Now what happens is that banks build things which are called bundles, anything up to 20 different swaps coming into the bundles, and therefore the bank itself therefore is receiving interest from one, receiving interest from another, and so on. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. Just stay now, this idea of two companies, they both borrow money, they pay each other's interest, and by doing this they save money. Just keep that in your mind for now. What we're going to do, therefore, is that we're going to go through a little example. We're going through the example. The example will show you how the swap works. So we've got two businesses here, one of which is called Steel Company, and one of which is called Accounting. Accounting was originally a spelling mistake, but it stuck with me all the way through the example. So Steel Company is a large company. Notice there that it's asset-backed. It wants to borrow $25 million fixed rate because it believes that interest rates will rise. And an investment bank tells it it can borrow floating rate at LIBOR plus 20 or fixed rate at 5%. Now let's just have a look at that. It wants to borrow 25 million fixed rate. Right, if you're borrowing fixed rate, therefore Steel is borrowing in the bond markets. Okay, so you're borrowing fixed rate in the bond markets. Now its bank advisor tells it it can borrow in the bond markets therefore at 5%, and it's 25 million. And at the end of the slide it tells you there that the loan is for 5 years. Right, the alternative to borrowing fixed rate is to borrow floating rate. If you're borrowing floating rate, you're borrowing from a bank. So it tells you there it can borrow at LIBOR plus 20. Right, LIBOR is the London Interbank Offer Rate, so this is the rate of interest that banks charge to each other, and then because you're not a bank, they're charging a premium, so the premium is 20. Right, 20 means 20 basis points, so 20 is actually 0.2%. So the bank can borrow floating rate, Steel can borrow floating rate at LIBOR plus 0.2%, or it can borrow fixed rate from the bond market at 5%. So that's our first company. Now notice that it's asset-backed. Asset-backed is important because it's telling you, what the question is telling you, what it means in real life, is that it's probably going to get a better deal from a bank, because banks like lots of assets that they can take security over. A large company like Steel, if it's borrowing in the bond markets, it's probably borrowing in the euro bond markets, and it would be unusual for them to take any form of security. Usually they just have a thing called default. That means if Steel defaults on one loan somewhere, it's deemed to default on all of them. But other than that, the Eurobond markets don't normally require security. So that's our deal is steel. Right, accounting is a consulting group, it's an accountancy firm or whatever, long history of profits, good credit rating. Right, a good credit rating is important because your credit rating will drive the rate of interest you have to pay in the bond market. Accounting believes interest rates will fall and it wants to borrow 25 million floating rate. The investment bank tells accounting it can borrow at LIBOR plus 90, so that's LIBOR plus 0.9%. And you're okay, I hope that LIBOR will change, that's why it's floating, yeah? Or a fixed rate of 5.2% in the bond markets. So therefore the yield it's giving being the combination of capital gain plus interest, 5.2% annualized. So those are your two deals. Steel company is a large company, it can borrow floating and fixed at the rates given in the question. Accounting the same. They both want 25 million and they both want for 5 years, which is your standard loan period. The investment bank offers to organise an interest rate swap for a fee of 10 basis points, so 0.1%, and that will be taken from the interest payments. Okay, that's your background. Right, please remember that. You have to keep coming back to that because that's important information for answering the question. Right, what we're doing in slide number 3 therefore is we're calculating what's called the differential. And the differential is the difference in advantage that steel has. Now what does that mean? Well, have a look at the table, and the table is just a collection of information that was given to you in slide 2. So it's just a collection of information which is straight from the question. So if you look at the floating rate, it tells you that steel can borrow at LIBOR plus 20 in the floating rate markets and 5 in the fixed rate markets. Accounting can borrow at LIBOR plus 90 in the floating rate markets and 5.2 in the fixed markets. Steel's advantage therefore is 70 basis points or 0.7% in the floating market and 20 basis points or 0.2% in the fixed market. So its advantage overall therefore is 50 basis points or half a percent. Right, that 0.5% is what we call the benefit, and that will be split. Now I'll show you how to split it, but for the purpose of this, remembering that this is quite simply just an exam style question, let's assume that it's split equally between the two companies. Now let me just caveat that, it's not actually strictly split equally between the two companies, because what happens is that the bank, if you remember, wants 10 basis points. So the bank wants 10 basis points of benefit, and therefore the two companies will get 20 basis points of benefit each. So in other words, your benefit to be split is 50 basis points, 10 will go to the bank, and 20 will go to steel, and 20 will go to accounting. Right, at the moment I haven't really told you what means benefit, so you'll see how the benefit works when we do the numbers. But that's what's going to happen at the moment, and that's what you need to understand for now. Okay, so hopefully you can see where those numbers come from, and that the differential that's referred to is the difference between the 70 and the 20, which is 50 basis points of benefit. And it says that the profit is to be shared. 10 goes to the bank, you're given that on slide 2, and 20 each will go to those two companies. What we've done now, therefore, is we've drawn a little picture. So in our little picture you can see that we've got accounting on the left, and I simply did them this way around because they're alphabetical, but we've got accounting on the left, we've got a bank in the middle, and we've got steel on the right. Now have a look at your arrows. What is actually going to happen is that accounting and steel are actually going to borrow money. So steel, if you remember from slide number 3, has the greatest advantage in the floating rate market. So steel will actually borrow floating rate. So in other words, it will go to its bank and it will borrow $25 million with a loan period of 5 years, and it will do that at a rate of LIBOR plus 20. Okay? Right, it's a swap. So if steel borrows floating rate from its bank, then accounting must borrow fixed rate. So it will actually have a bond issue with a yield on those bonds of 5.2%, and that's what's happening there. So the arrows which are coming down from accounting and up from steel are those two transactions. Accounting will pay 5.2 fixed, and steel will pay LIBOR plus 20 floating. The two sets of arrows in the middle, which go from accounting to the bank and the bank to steel, those are going to be the terms of your swap. So there's your picture, and you've got your three parties: accounting, your bank, and steel. So all that we've done here is that we've just summarized that narrative that I gave you on the last slide. So steel is the largest company, so by sort of convention, we start with steel. Steel will issue into the market in which it has the largest advantage. So from slide 3, it has the largest advantage in the floating rate market. Steel will therefore borrow 25 million from the bank. The rate it pays was given to you on slide number 2. And accounting therefore will issue bonds with a value of 25 million, and the interest it pays is, from memory, 5.2%. Okay, so far you've just got the actual loans. The swap transactions are independent from the loans, at least as far as the classroom is concerned. Right, in slide number 6, therefore, we've started to fill in some of the numbers. So please notice, therefore, that accounting, our arrows have gone from up to down or down to up. Accounting will pay 5.20% or 5.2% fixed to the bond market, which is shown there, and steel will pay LIBOR plus 20. So this little diagram simply shows us who will pay what sums of interest. Now we said what's going to happen is that the two organisations will go through this process, which is something approximating to paying each other's interest. Right, have a look on slide number 2. It tells us that if accounting had borrowed at floating rate, it would have paid LIBOR plus 90. So get your English grammar right in there, all of your woulds, coulds and shoulds. If it had borrowed at floating rate, it would have paid LIBOR plus 90. So what we're going to do is we're going to treat that as a constant. So we've got accounting there, and we're simply showing it as paying LIBOR plus 90. So if it had borrowed at floating rate, it would have paid LIBOR plus 90. So we treat that as a wash through. In other words, if accounting pays LIBOR plus 90, then that will go through the bank and come out to steel. Right, I hope you're okay therefore with the LIBOR plus 90. It actually doesn't matter. You could have said that steel would have paid fixed rate, and you could have put 5% in there. It'll just gives you slightly different numbers to play with. Right, so LIBOR plus 90 is a fixed rate. And we've got a straight wash through there. Now have a look at steel's position. If, as our picture stands at the moment, steel is paying LIBOR plus 20, but it's receiving LIBOR plus 90. So steel is actually receiving 0.7% based on 25 million for doing nothing at the moment. So that's your current position. You've just put that LIBOR in as a constant. And now we're going to play around with the fixed rate numbers. Play around with the fixed rate numbers to see what will actually happen next. Right, hope you're okay. If you have any questions on this stuff or you're totally lost, send us a message through the website and then we'll come back to you, and we can even speak to you on the phone or something. Okay? Okay, slide number 7. Now we're starting to get into the mathematics a little bit. And once you understand where the numbers have come from, it's actually very simple. It's just getting your head around where the numbers are to begin with. Right, based on slide number 6, we said if we're just looking at steel for now, we said that steel is receiving 70 basis points. Right, the 70 basis points is the fact that it's receiving LIBOR plus 90 from accounting, and it's paying LIBOR plus 20 out to its bank on its floating rate loan. The net effect, therefore, for steel is that it's receiving 70 basis points. Right, make sure you're okay with that. Stop the tape and have a look at that. Now, let's go back to the very beginning to what would have been slide number 2, slide number 3. We said that, in fact, steel wanted to pay fixed rate, if you remember that. And that's the concept of the swap. You're seeing how, certainly in terms of an exam question, how this is going. They want fixed rate, so they issue floating rate and then swap into fixed rate. Yeah. So we said originally that if they wanted fixed rate, they would have to pay 5%. Everybody remember that? And that's given to you back on, I think it's slide number 2, slide number 3. Right, but we also said that they would get 20 basis points of benefit. So everybody remember the differential. We calculated the differential, and the differential was 50 basis points of benefit. So there, which is 0.2%. Yeah. So remember that we said that accounting would get 20 basis points of benefit. We said steel would get 20 basis points of benefit, and we said the bank took 10. So 20, 20, 10 gives you 50. Right. Therefore, the net cost to steel must be 4.8%. 4.8% is 5% minus 0.2%, or minus 20 basis points of benefit. So your net cost must be 4.8%. Right, okay with that. Point number 3. If steel is currently receiving 0.7%, being LIBOR plus 90 minus LIBOR plus 20, then it must pay 5.5. Why must it pay 5.5? Because we said that it must pay 5.5, sorry, we said it must pay 4.8. It's already receiving 0.7 for doing nothing, so it must pay 5.5. And the net of that gives you 4.8. Right, that might be a wee bit tricky. So let's just have a look at the picture and you'll see. Just look at steel to begin with and you'll see what's happening here. And the slide says that the bank takes 10 basis points. So you'll see how that works as well. So now I hope that all of my talking becomes a bit clearer when you see the picture. Just have a look at steel. It's receiving LIBOR plus 90, paying LIBOR plus 20. So the net of that is a gain of the net of that is a gain of 0.7. So what we said is it will pay across to the bank 5.5%. Why does it pay 5.5? Because if you calculate out the net of the three, the two LIBORs cancel. It's receiving 0.7% therefore. So it pays back 5.5. 5.5 minus 0.7 gives you 4.8. Right, why does it have to be 4.8? Because if you go back to slides 2 and 3, we were told that if it wanted to borrow in the bond markets, it would have to pay 5%, but the benefit of the swap was going to be 20 basis points. So therefore, the net effect of all of this has to be that steel pays 4.8%. And that is what you've got there for steel. Now have a look at accounting's position. Can you see that the bank needs to get paid 10 basis points? So the bank therefore is taking its 5.5 it receives from steel and it takes its cut of 10 basis points. It doesn't matter whether it takes it from the LIBOR or the fixed rate, whichever one makes more sense. But the bank has to get paid. So the bank therefore pays across to accounting 5.4. Right, look at accounting's position. If you just look at the fixed rates, it's receiving 5.4 and paying 5.2. So it's got a gain of 20 basis points or 0.2%. But it's paying out floating rate LIBOR plus 90. So the effect of all of that is that it's paying LIBOR plus 70. So accounting's position paying floating rate LIBOR plus 0.7%. Right, go back to slides 2 and 3 and you will see that if accounting had borrowed money from the bank, it would have to pay LIBOR plus 90. And we said it was going to get 20 basis points of benefit. And there's your 20 basis points of benefit there. You can see that your company accounting, your non-asset backed business is actually paying net of LIBOR plus 70. Which is LIBOR plus 90, which it would have paid to the bank, minus those 20 basis points of benefit. So all that we've got on slide number 9, therefore, is that we've just got a little summary of the maths here. And I think certainly for those of you studying ICAEW, for those of you that are studying ACCA, certainly the last time I looked at it is that if you can get the principles of this, you actually don't need to draw the picture. You can actually just skip the picture. Just my experience of teaching ACCA and ICAEW swaps is that when people see the pictures, it makes more sense. Yeah, people who are driven by visual understanding. So the object of the exercise is, and the question set it out neatly for you. Steel wants fixed rate, so your mind immediately should go, okay, so we issue floating rate and then we swap into fixed. You can calculate the differential. You understand they get 20 points of benefit, so therefore you know that it's 5% minus 20 basis points of benefit. So you don't need to draw the picture. Personally, sometimes the picture helps. And accounting, it tells you pays 5.2 in LIBOR plus 90, but receives 5.4. The net is LIBOR plus 70, which is 20 basis points less than if they had borrowed floating. So that's how it works. And that's what happens in real life. You want to borrow floating rate, so you borrow fixed, swap into floating, and by doing it you cut your cost of borrowing. And certainly for very, very large companies, the British American Tobaccos and so on, Philip Morris and so on of this world, you can actually end up borrowing at rates which are considerably less than LIBOR. So you're borrowing at rates are less than the rates at which the bank that's advising you can borrow at. The markets are huge. In terms of money changing hands, it's absolutely phenomenal with the cash that's changing with these things. And usually, in fact, what happens with them as well is that they're linked to currency. So let's assume that Swiss francs, for example, this week are very, very cheap. You can borrow Swiss francs floating and swap into pounds fixed, and by doing that, you'll cut your costs even more. So you'll maximize that differential. It does introduce, therefore, some element of currency risk as well. That's the maths of how they work. In terms of answering exam questions, certainly historical ACCA and ICAEW questions have looked like that. You'll be given the information, so learn it as a series of steps. Set out your table, calculate your differential. When you've got your differential, split it between the two, taking into account the bank, and you'll get your answer. And that's exactly how it works in real life. Okay, one more slide to go. I have to say that no exam question, and also for any sort of practitioners who are looking at these things, you have to look at what the risks of these things are. And the risks are very, very substantial. You just flick on the internet and there's massive numbers of organisations that swapped from fixed rate into floating rate swaps, and then interest rates moved against them. Allied Lions, I think, lost 115 million or something. There was the town of Carmel where they were playing with these in California, and they lost their entire budget. So you have a wooden town where Clint Eastwood was the mayor, and they've no money for fire services and so on. But by far the obvious risk here is the risk which is for accounting, and that accounting borrows fixed rate and then it swaps into floating rate. And by doing that, it is assuming risk. Now, accounting is assuming that interest rates will fall, but if they don't, if they actually rise, then their cost of borrowing is going to go through the roof. And that is a very, very, very significant risk. And anyone entering in these things needs to be completely sure that they understand exactly what the risks of these things are, because they are large. And history has shown us many, many times that they are very, very real risks as well. Okay, that's your risk profile, which really affects your borrowers. Certainly from the perspective here of Steel, the larger company, they borrowed floating rate and then swapped into fixed. So for them, they've actually hedged their risk. And so therefore, you can see that swaps can be used to hedge risk. What we've got here are usually what are called back swaps. So in other words, there's an actual underlying loan that backs the swap as well. But in real life, a lot of people use these things for gambling. So there is no underlying loan. You just enter into the swap without the loan. And the reason you do it is to try and make money. You think interest rates are going to fall, so you swap into floating rate, and then if you win on the gamble, and it is nothing other than a gamble, you earn your company some money. Right, that's the floating rate risk, and that's by far the main risk. The other two are risks for the bank. Basis risk is a risk which doesn't really exist anymore, but in the early days of swaps, it hit many banks. Basis risk is the situation where if you look at the bank is receiving LIBOR plus 90 from accounting and paying LIBOR plus 90 to Steel. The underlying assumption that we made in the question, therefore, is that LIBOR is the same. So the sum of money that you receive is is the same from accounting as you're paying out to steal. Certainly in the early days of swaps, back in the early sort of 1970s and so on, you had various organisations that were doing this, and then they were finding that those rates of LIBOR were different. So they were receiving 3-month LIBOR and they were paying 6-month LIBOR, or vice versa. So the effect, therefore, is that the basis of calculation of the floating rate interest, or the basis of calculation, I suppose, for the fixed rate was different. Right, therefore it's a standard documentation check for the bank, and it's also, for those of you who are working for audit firms, it's a standard documentation check that what you're receiving equals what you're paying. The bank also, obviously, within their bundles, when you've got 20 swaps coming in, 20 swaps going out, will assume risk. So this may be a managed risk position that they know about, but it's called basis risk, and it's where what you're receiving is not the same as what you're paying out for a different basis of calculation. The final one is default risk. This again is normally a risk for the bank. Let's assume that accounting goes bankrupt and LIBOR rises. The bank therefore has a risk that what it's paying out to steal is rising and rising, and that those rising payments out are not matched by rising payments coming in. So default risk is the risk for the bank, and assuming default risk is why, obviously, why they get paid. Okay, that's interest rate swaps. You need to have this kind of an understanding of what they are. If you're not a student and you're doing it in real life, you need to understand what they're used for as well. And your bank will explain this to you. They give you access to cheap money, so you can borrow more cheaply. Please, you do have to have a very clear understanding of what it is that you're getting into. And if you're borrowing fixed rate, swapping into floating rate, please make sure you're completely okay with what you're doing. I believe that the British government now is attacking us at Royal Bank of Scotland this week for selling these products to people who don't need them. If you're a student, I would go through the steps. I like the picture. The picture makes it clear in my mind, and it doesn't take you very long to draw. And if you're not particularly artistic, 3 sort of rough rectangles with some lines coming off them are not any great problem. But certainly for ACCA, ICAEW, if you can get away without doing the pictures, then you're fine. Okay, thanks for that then. Please, if you liked us, tell us so. If you want more clarity, leave comments, blah blah blah. Please like us on Facebook. Thank you very much for your time, and enjoy your swaps.